I'm delighted to welcome Dr. David Gwynn to speak to us about Bryneglwys Quarry, Abergynolwyn village and the World Heritage bid, the bid to UNESCO for World Heritage status for the North West Wales slate landscape areas. So David is a heritage consultant, an archaeologist and a historian specialising in the industrial archaeology of Wales, including the slate quarrying industry. And David's publications include Gwynedd Inheriting a Revolution, The Archaeology of Industrialisation in North West Wales, and Welsh Slate, Archaeology and History of an Industry. He's currently an advisor to Gwynedd Council in relation to the bid for World Heritage status. And as I said, he will be delivering this talk in English.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, to say thank you very much for the invitation to come speak to you this evening. And what I would like to share with you is some of the thinking that went into putting together the World Heritage bid for the slate landscape of Northwest Wales, and Abergynolwyn's part in that, the village of Abergynolwyn's part in that, and the part of Bryneglwys Quarry. I'm not going to be talking quite so much about the Talchan Railway because one might say that Talchan has already had quite a lot of the oxygen of publicity, and the case maybe needs to be set out for the other elements of this part of the World Heritage bid. Let me begin then by showing you what actually is being submitted or has been submitted to UNESCO for World Heritage status. Now, this map of Gwynedd shows you in red the 6 component parts, so-called, of the bid. Many World Heritage sites or prospective World Heritage sites are just one big area. This one is different. It's made up of 6 areas, and from north to south they are the Penrhyn Slate Quarry, the village or town of Bethesda, Penrhyn Castle, Port Penrhyn, and the 2 railway systems that connected them. Just to the southwest of Penrhyn Quarry, the landscape of the Dinorwic Slate Quarry, the National Slate Museum, the lake, which slate was transported, and the settlements associated with Dinorwic Quarry. Further still to the southwest, a much more tightly defined area, the Nantlla Slate Quarrying area, where I live, quarries like Dorothea and Cilgwyn and Penderorsedd. To the south, a Y-shaped or a bifurcated shape, Prince of Wales Quarry, Gorsedda Slate Quarry, and the railways that connected them to the big slab mill at Ynys y Pandy. Then the Festiniog Slate Quarries, the Festiniog Railway, the harbour at Porthmadog, and the house and the grounds at Plas Tan-y-Bwlch, which were owned by a family that also had very significant interests in the Blaenau slate industry. And then we come south to your part of the world, to Bryneglwys Quarry, the Talchan railway system and the mineral line, and the village of Abergynolwyn. Now, I think the first question I'd like to anticipate and answer is this: what is a World Heritage Site? Now, to cut a long story short, a World Heritage Site is a site that has been inscribed by UNESCO, United Nations Educational and Scientific Council, as of outstanding universal value to the whole of humankind. In other words, it gets that status if it can demonstrate that it somehow means something to the world as a whole. So in other words, somebody from Colombia or Afghanistan could come to Bethesda or to Abergynolwyn or to Blaenau Festiniog and say, yeah, okay, I get this. I understand what this is about. World Heritage Sites don't come with a cash prize. This is the other thing I need to break to you right away. It's almost like a Blue Peter badge. It's nice to have, you can put it on your school blazer, but it doesn't actually give you anything, and it doesn't necessarily involve any change at all in terms of planning, what you can do with your house, how you lead your lives. So it's, in a sense, a very high heritage designation, and it has very little immediate impact at one and the same time. Now, where do we begin, without going into great detail about the heritage of the slate industry as a whole, where do we begin with Abergynolwyn, Bryneglwys, and the Talchin Railway, but particularly the quarry and the village? Well, I think the first person who put the quarry and the village on the heritage map was this fellow, and I'm sure you all recognise Tom Rolt, who was instrumental in saving the Talchin Railway after Sir Henry Hayden-Jones died. Now, Rolt was utterly captivated, as I'm sure you know, by the Talchin Railway. He was rather dubious about the quarry. This is what he said about the quarry. "A wild and lonely place, so remote was it from the world below in its high cleft in the mountains. It was as though its busy occupants had been on a sudden spirited away into the mountains, while the solitude and stillness of the old quarry bred the disquieting fancy that they might suddenly, like troglodytes, appear from dark, dripping tunnels, from vertiginous shafts, or from the chasms of open workings and collapsed subterranean chambers." So the quarry was a mysterious place. I'd have to say he was a lot less enamoured of the village, and this is what he says of it. "The houses of Abergynolwyn," he said, "were, and I quote, as dark, as dour, and as incapable of concession to their surroundings as those which were terracing the valleys of the Rhondda and the Ebble. It looks as though a section has been arbitrarily chopped out of a mean street in an industrial city and transplanted in the abortive hope that it might take root and grow." Well, I think that's a bit harsh. What's always struck me about this part of the world is that it reflects fundamentally one major historical process, which is the arrival of capital to this remote Welsh valley in the 1860s. And if you love the Talchin Railway, then I think you ought to love Bryneglwys Quarry, and you ought to love the village of Abergynolwyn, because they are all very much to do with each other. And the three pillars, in a sense, of the bid have always been not just the productive sites, the quarries and the mines themselves, but also the transport links that took slate to either the sea, or in the case of the Talchin Railway, to the mainline railway system, and the settlements associated with them. So I'll be saying a little bit more about that in a little while, but as I say, my first point would have to be that presenting the heritage of a particular area to UNESCO is not the same as writing its history. It's a matter of teasing out some of the important points, some of the salient characteristics of these areas, and seeing how they fit in with UNESCO's own criteria for what makes a World Heritage Site, or a potential World Heritage Site. Now, there are 10 criteria by which a World Heritage Site can be inscribed, either as a natural site or as a cultural site. This is a cultural site. I'm not going to go through each and every one of them with you, but I am going to show you the criteria under which the slate landscape of Northwest Wales has been nominated. So first of all, we went for the second criterion, an important interchange of human values, particularly in the period from 1780 to 1940, on developments in architecture and technology. Then criterion 4, an outstanding example of a type of landscape which illustrates in a dramatic way the combined works of nature and of man through the large-scale exploitation of natural resources. Now, I think that's one that you can really see applies to the slate landscape. You really do get a very strong sense of how quarrymen came to work these landscapes, to quarry slate, to mine slate, to tip the rubble, but you also have a very strong sense of humans inscribing the natural environment through the creation of settlements and communities and through the creation of transport links. But also this one, an outstanding example of the industrial transformation of a traditional human settlement and marginal agrarian land use pattern, and how a remarkably homogeneous minority culture adapted to modernity in the industrial era. Now, we could talk about this at very great length. I don't think we've got time to do so, but this is how we've tried to answer the implied questions behind these criteria. Welsh slates have been used on buildings all over the world. Buildings of the great, the buildings of ordinary people. The chronological period is British industrialization, the British Industrial Revolution. It's also not just defined in terms of when, but the specific geopolitical region of the world with which it's associated: Europe, Britain, and European colonialism. And in particular, the effect that the slates that have been produced in places like Bryneglwys have transformed building styles across the world, but also particular technologies have been exported, in particular the narrow gauge railway. So there's a lot here potentially that we can say, and we have, by the way, only to prove one of these criteria for the bid to be successful. So I hope that UNESCO agrees that we've satisfied all three, but we'll have to see about that. Now, the British Industrial Revolution. Well, the slate industry of Northwest Wales follows a common trajectory. It begins with low-scale operations, limited capitalization in the late 18th century. It is already the market leader by the end of the 18th century, and it grows in the course of the 19th century. Now, I'd like to think that when Pugh, the local entrepreneur who first developed Bryneglwys Quarry, was operating, it might have looked something like this. Now, this isn't Bryneglwys Quarry. I'm sorry to say it's actually a quarry in the English Lake District, but it's a very nice illustration of how the early phase of the slate industry might have looked. Bryneglwys, of course, develops on a quite significant scale. Okay, it never gets to be an undertaking the size of Oakley in Blaenfestiniog, or Penryn at Bethesda, or the Dinorwic Quarry, but it becomes quite a significant operation in terms of the southern part of Gwynedd. And because it's partly above ground, partly below ground, there's some very interesting survival of historic machinery and artifacts and other historic assets. The surface of the quarry hasn't fared particularly well. And when we were at an early stage of the bid, I was trying to discuss with two colleagues, Dr. Sean Rees of Cadw and Sir Neil Cossons, who just ceased to be Chair of English Heritage at the time, that this was a place that really should be incorporated in the bid. So I took them up to the surface workings, and initially they were very dismissive. They said, no, there's not enough here. Bit by bit, I was able to show them more and more of the surface workings. Then we had a look at the village. Then we had a look at the Taliesin Railway, and they were converted. But in a sense, part of the glory of Bryneglwys is that it is an underground working where artifacts survive. So even though it may not be particularly striking as a surface landscape, once you can go underground, there's a great deal more to see. Furthermore, I think it's true to say of the slate industry that when you go underground, you're brought right up against the world of the working quarryman. You see graffiti scratched with people's names. In some places, you can even see cigarette packets, shoes, coats. Not so much at Bryneglwys, which has been closed for quite a long time, but there is nevertheless a wealth of underground features surviving there. Its surface features, once you start looking, are, I think, very interesting as well. And what I find compelling about the quarry is the way that surface and underground features relate with each other. For instance, the chain incline system that I'm sure many of you will be aware of in the quarry not only hauled from an open pit, but it also hauled from the underground workings. Now, I'm going to say a little bit more about the technology of Bryneglwys in just a little bit, but having referred to the first Welsh entrepreneur, Hugh, who worked the place, I'd just like to share with you some thoughts about some of the other guys. Now, Bryneglwys Quarry has had its share of historians. James Boyd wrote a book about the railway and the quarry, primarily a railway historian. Alan Holmes, who was a graduate of the Glaston Industrial Archaeology Recording courses, wrote a very detailed archaeological study of the quarry, and that was republished fairly recently by Sarah Eade, which includes a photograph of this splendid individual, Robert Williams Caeringan. Now, this is where we can start discussing the interchange of human values, because we've found it easy, I think historically, to say that the output of the Welsh slate industry has changed building styles. Slates go all over the world. It's also influenced technology all over the world, particularly in the use of narrow gauge railways. And it's also evidently an industry that learned from outside the slate industry. You see technology that's been, like for instance, the beam engine at Dorothea Quarry, just a couple of miles up the road from me, a typical piece of Cornish technology. What I find interesting about Bryneglwys Quarry is the way that it shows internal transfer of technology from elsewhere in the industry to Bryneglwys, and this is where Robert Williams fits in. We know a lot about Robert Williams because he wrote his autobiography. It was published a few years after he died in Cymru Coch, and he traces his life from the very early years of the 19th century through to his effective retirement in the 1870s. And he came down from the Nantlle region to Bryneglwys as effectively the quarry manager. It wasn't his only posting away from home, because one of the things that he makes very clear in his autobiography is just how very peripatetic a skilled quarryman could be in the early years of the 19th century. We tend to think of them as people who stayed at home, but they didn't. He worked in Devon, he worked in Llanberis, he worked in Merionethshire. His autobiography is also interesting because he's very frank about himself, and also, unusually, for a man of that time, he doesn't seem to have been particularly interested in religion. There's nothing in his autobiography about going to chapel or the moment of conversion or whatever. His son-in-law helped him with the autobiography, and he was a Calvinistic Methodist minister, but Robert Williams seems to have prepared a fairly frank account of what it was like to be a quarry manager in those days. Now, he worked with, possibly not on very friendly terms with, this fellow. This is John Lloyd Jones. Now, the 1860s, when this whole show gets on the road, were a boom period for the slate industry of North Wales, a boom period for the slate industry generally. And John Lloyd Jones' speciality, he was another Nantlle man, was buying up quarry leases, developing them to some extent, and then palming them off on other investors at immense profit to himself. Now, whether you can quite call him a crook, I don't know. Victorian business ethics were a lot more dubious than our own, and that's saying something. But he kept on the right side of the law. Nevertheless, his finger is in just about every slate quarrying pie, from the Conwy Valley down to Bryneglwys. And amongst his specialities was having himself appointed receiver of failed businesses, so that bit by bit he came to be their outright owner, and he was able to sell them on. Now, he was the son of John Jones Talsarn, who was the manager of Dorothea Slate Quarry and a Calvinistic Methodist minister. In fact, the most famous, the most eloquent, some would say, preacher of his generation in Wales. So this is how, if you like, the non-conformist elite of Wales made its mark on Bryneglwys before the McConnell brothers arrive on the scene. And this is a plan of Penarosedd Quarry in about 1866. I don't know, I'll perhaps not bother trying to point it out to you, but you can just about see to the left of the big pits a mechanical device for raising blocks from the quarry pit, water powered. This is the origin of the chain incline that was constructed at Bryneglwys. In other words, John Lloyd Jones, and more to the point, Robert Williams, devised a system similar to the ones they were familiar with in their own part of the world. So what we've got here is a very nice example of technology transfer within the industry. So a device that is developed in one particular quarrying area of the slate landscapes of northwest Wales, you can see is transferred to Bryneglwys. Furthermore, there is no evidence left in the Nantlle area for this type of technology, not at any rate water wheel driven ones. So we now have to turn to Bryneglwys to see how this particular technology functioned. And I find these haulage systems particularly interesting because they're very much artisan technology. They're not engineered, they're not fancy, they're fit for purpose, but they're found all over the slate industry and not just in northwest Wales. Here is one at the Fairhaven Slate Quarry in Vermont, installed in the late 1850s, and guess when Welshmen arrived? 1850. So again, clearly a technology that's been transplanted to other parts of the world, but still within the context of the slate industry. This one is powered by steam. Furthermore, very similar ropeway systems are found in the very substantial French slate quarries in the Loire Valley. Now, I've been trying hard to find out whether there's any evidence of technological links between the Loire Valley and Wales, and so far I've failed to do so. Certainly, there were study visits from French engineers to North Wales from the Loire quarries to Blaenau-Ffestiniog, to Nantlle, to Bryneglwys, but whether you can say that chain inclines in the French slate industry derive from Welsh practice is very difficult to say. I don't know what the answer is to that, but it allows us to ask questions and perhaps to kick ideas around. And also, if these devices were invented simultaneously in different places, I think that tells us a fair amount about the ingenuity of slate quarry engineers and how similar problems dictate similar answers. Now, this particular feature of Bryneglwys quarry survives quite well. It's rather difficult to work out exactly how it functioned, but it may be that there'll be the opportunity in the years to come to carry out a proper survey of this chain incline system and learn a little bit more about how it operated. So that's one reason why Bryneglwys quarry makes a very convincing case for World Heritage. Another aspect of its history that I find particularly intriguing is the way that in the 1860s the McConnell brothers became interested in the place. Now, it's often said that this was as a consequence of the cotton famine during the American Civil War. Most cotton came from most of the cotton that was going to cotton mills in Lancashire, Manchester in particular, came from the southern states, the Confederate states, during the Civil War, and the Union blockade prevented them reaching Liverpool and hence Manchester. And so the argument runs that industrialists in Lancashire were looking for ways to diversify their capital and were buying shares in other types of business as well. And that's why the McConnells suddenly start getting very interested in slate. Well, that may be so. It's a very interesting reflection that the development, the creation really, of the village of Abergynolwyn and the development of Bryneglwys quarry might have come about as a consequence of a very gruesome quarrel that was taking place on the other side of an ocean. Part of the strategy of Confederate thinking was that England, Britain, the United Kingdom, would have to come in on their side during the Civil War, support them, because the economy of the northwest of England depended so much on cotton. And that's the origin of the phrase, cotton is king. Now, in fact, this was a very significant miscalculation on the part of the Confederacy, because the North and the United Kingdom had even stronger links. And there's also this extraordinary story about the Lancashire cotton famine, which is the extent to which cotton workers who were opposed to slavery refused to support the South. They remained unwavering in their support for the Northern cause, even though it was not to their financial advantage. And this was one of the factors that swung middle-class opinion behind granting the vote, at least to some working-class men, in 1867, that the Lancashire cotton operatives had shown that they could behave in a moral and responsible way, and hence that they were fit for the franchise. So the links here between this quarry and this village in northwest Wales and the broader movement of capital in a lead sector of the Industrial Revolution, those links are very strong. Why should two brothers who represent, if you like, the leading sector of the leading sector, Lancashire textiles, why should they have chosen to invest in slate? One argument may be that they'd spotted the way that slate made money. Now, as I say, the 1860s, 1863 onwards, period of real boom in the slate industry. So that's possibly one reason they saw this as another speculation that was going to make them money. It's quite extraordinary. If you look at the list of companies that were incorporated with the Board of Trade in London from the late 1850s to the early 1870s, a quite extraordinary number of them are to do with quarrying slate. To the extent that in 1866, just before the boom turns to bust with the Overend and Gurney financial collapse, one company in every 9 registered with the Board of Trade is to do with quarrying for slate. So it just gives you some idea of how much capital was actually moving into the industry from other industries, and the fact that this wasn't some sort of small-scale anachronistic process going on in a remote Welsh valley. It was very much at the heart of the movement of capital throughout the United Kingdom, and that in turn reflected geopolitical events. It's interesting as well, by the way, that of course the quarry wasn't the only example of diversification on the McConnell's part. They did try and get into iron and steel as well. So it would be interesting to know what their rationale was, but certainly the slate industry was attracting capital in a serious way at this time, because it was going to generate more capital for people. That was the idea. Now, after 1866, that it was obvious that that wasn't going to be the case. Again, the boom in the slate industry lasted another 11 years, but 1863 to 1866 was like a Klondike in the slate industry, and also gave ample space for rather dodgy speculators like John Lloyd Jones to do their thing. Now, it's an interesting reflection, of course, that after the McConnells had their way with the quarry, it should have gone back into local hands, and that it should have been purchased by Sir Henry Hayden Jones. So, if you like, having been part of the speculative world of people like John Lloyd Jones and Robert Williams Caeringan, it becomes part of the world of the next generation of Welsh liberal nonconformists. Now, Sir Henry Hayden Jones was, I always feel, the absolute opposite of his brother MP in the northern part of Gwynedd, David Lloyd George. David Lloyd George was a fiery orator, a radical, always one for change. Sir Henry Hayden Jones was a much, much more placid version of a Liberal MP. He barely spoke in the House of Commons. He opposed trade unions on principle, and he pointed out that he'd only bought the quarry and the railway to provide employment with people, and that if the quarrymen didn't like it, then they could cone work in the forestry. But it's interesting as well that he was a businessman who had a finger in every local pie. He was involved in Abergynolwyn quarry as well. I think he liked railways because he kept both the Taliesin and the Corris Railway operational. He refused to consider a move over to railway transport. And this, of course, is the famous photograph of him taken in, I think, 1947 for Picture Post, a railway king in his lair. He'd ceased to be Member of Parliament by then. He lost his seat in the Labour landslide of 1945, so that's a telling event as well. But he would turn up in his frock coat and his wing collar to keep the Taliesin Railway in operation. So there's a little bit about the quarry. What about the village? Well, let's just remind ourselves of Rolt's rather unkind words about Abergynolwyn village. incapable of concession to their surroundings as those which were terracing the valleys of the Rhondda and the Ebw, a section arbitrarily chopped out of a mean street in an industrial city and transplanted in the abortive hope that it might take root and grow. One of the things that I've been at pains to achieve in the World Heritage bid is a representative cross-section of different types of industrial community. So, for instance, you have in the Ogwen Valley, Bethesda, the village or town, it was briefly a town of Bethesda, which was constructed on a tiny strip of land that did not belong to Lord Penrhyn. And this was obviously quite deliberate. People were clearly saying, I'm prepared to work in your slate quarry, but I'm not prepared to live on your estate as well. So this tiny little bit of land that he didn't own along the turnpike road, that's where the quarrymen set up their village, and a rather ad hoc place it was too. It was a long, straggling, linear settlement along the post road. The other side of the valley, you have the very ordered cottages and gardens of Mynydllandigai, which was set out by the Penrhyn estate. The idea being there that you rooted the quarrymen in the soil and you turned them really into an industrious, forelock-tugging peasant class. You can see the same sort of social pressures going on around the Dinorwic quarry, places owned by the Bryneglwys estate, where the quarrymen were put onto the land in the hope that they would behave themselves, and little bits of land that didn't belong to the Bryneglwys estate where the quarrymen created their villages. Nantlla village is the nearest, I think, to Abergynolwyn in the bid, in that it is a company village. It's a village sponsored by the people who own the quarry. In that particular case, the Unitarian owners of Penrhyn quarry. Bryneglwys is different again. Bryneglwys is the most urban of the settlements. It's set out like a town, like a Victorian industrial town, which is what it is, except it has big nonconformist chapels at the corner of the town squares, just as you would have had an Anglican church in a Georgian, a Hanoverian town in England. So what about Abergynolwyn? Designed by James Stevens, the Manchester architect, who was perpetually at daggers drawn with Robert Williams, Rolt was right in a way that it did represent a little slice of a northern industrial town plonked down in the middle of a Welsh valley. But that, it seems to me, is the whole point of the thing. And what I found so strange about Rolt's attitude to the whole area was the way that he favoured some aspects of this development and did not like others. And I think this tells us a lot about Rolt's approach to the past, that he was very, very selective in what he was prepared to endorse. So the village, in his opinion, no, unattractive, mean, the railway, charming and delightful, the quarry, mysterious and forbidding. So the fact that we see the Lancashire, the industrial origins of Abergynolwyn as a community, I think is very telling indeed. There's of course some interesting variation in the architecture of the village. You have these comparatively substantial houses on the, now let me get this right, the southeast end of the village, which contrast with the rather smaller ones that I showed you in the last slide. And of course, another feature of the village that very much ties it in with actually both the quarry and the railway is this, so far as I'm aware, unique feature, the village incline and the railway system along the streets of the village. I know there is a theory that when the railway was being constructed, it hadn't been completed all the way down to tow in, that they built the top section first, and that for a while slates were lowered down the village incline and put into carts at its foot, and then transported on to Abergynolwyn. But as I'm sure you're all aware, for many, many years, until it stopped work in about 1940, it was used to deliver groceries and goods to the village. And of course, there was the return traffic in night soil from Abergynolwyn privies, which was then taken down the line and spread over the fields. So the relationship between the three elements of this particular part, Quarry, the railway and the village, is very, very strong. If you like, the rail system unites them. And here is Abergynolwyn viewed from above, the Victorian developments and the later ones. So I think that this is also something that brings home how relevant the criteria, the UNESCO criteria, are to Abergynolwyn and Bryneglwys. That this was a very transformative sort of place in its time. It's an industrial community of a sort that had not existed before. It's a nucleated community. It's a village where before there had been scattered farms. It created something of an industrial working class on a very small scale, and in ways that still, in a sense, preserved that rural origin. So that's where we can see the transformation of a traditional way of life that nevertheless retained many of its traditional attributes. And of course, the most important one there is the Welsh language. Industrialization and incorporation into a larger capitalist system very often, of course, does great damage to local particularism and to a minority language. And that just wasn't the case in the slate landscapes of Northwest Wales. I think it's fair to say that industrialization actually gave the Welsh language here a very considerable shot in the arm. That wasn't the case, for instance, in the iron and coal industries of Southeast Wales, where the pressures to use English became ultimately overwhelming. Here, what was created was a culture drawn from the local farms, where the language not merely survived, but was made infinitely stronger. And so, of course, it remains. So, the question is, where do we go from here? Here is Abergynolwyn. It's at, if you like, a crossroads. What does the World Heritage Bid mean for the community? Well, as I said at the beginning, it's not a prescriptive thing. The World Heritage Bid won't set out rules for how the community is to regulate itself. It sets out no rules at all. It doesn't come with a cash prize. It does offer the possibility of grant aid for community projects, because grant awarding bodies like applications that come from places that have been inscribed as World Heritage Sites, but that is not a given. I would like to see it as a permissive process. In other words, it opens doors. But ultimately, and Gwynedd Council has made this clear from the start, it is the local communities that remain in the driving seat on this one. There is no attempt to turn these places into Disneyland, to make them tourist venues, to develop tourism, if that's not what people in local communities want. What I do hope the World Heritage Bid will do is place the community right at the heart of heritage by showing just what these powerful, fascinating, compelling places in Northwest Wales do have to offer in terms of community pride and in also telling our story to the whole of the world. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
David, thank you. That was very, very interesting and informative. I'm sure everyone will agree. Now then, I'm going to try and attempt to put everybody's microphones and cameras on if they would like to. Are people able to turn on their own, or do I have to do that centrally? Oh yes, you can turn them on yourselves, right? Okay. So I think everybody will agree that, you know, there's a lot of food for thought there, and certainly those of us that live in Abergynolwyn, it's fascinating to fill in the missing bits of history. So I think we all know a bit, but none of us know as much as David. So at this point, I'd like to hand over to John, who's going to chair a question and answer session.
There's a lot of appreciation coming through there, David, for how you've presented and put forward everything this evening. I suggest that we perhaps look at the questions in two parts, if we could do. One is around the history side of what David's talked about, and then the second bit is around anything associated with the World Heritage and what that might actually mean. So with a bit of luck, if people who are wishing to ask questions, if they could put their hand up using the reaction button, which is the one on the very bottom of your screen. Everybody who puts their hand up should then be appearing on my list as on the top. At present, I don't seem to have any questions, but I'm throwing it open to everybody who's here today to see if you've got any questions at all to ask David. Okay, I'll take one coming in on the chat, if I may, unless Colin wishes to ask himself. Colin, do you want to ask the question yourself?
John, I was only doing that because my dog was thinking about
it. Right, okay.
we can try. Hi, David. Superb presentation. Thanks a lot, Giacomo. Can I ask a related question? Why weren't the quarries of the Corris area included in the World Heritage Site application, given both their wonderful history, but also how related they are, as indeed you mentioned in the presentation, to the Taliesin area?
That's a very good question, and I'm glad you asked it. We were hoping initially to include Abergynolwyn Quarry. Now, one of the things that UNESCO is absolutely adamant about is that you cannot submit a World Heritage bid where there's any sort of extant mineral permission. The reason that they do that is because they are terrified of, you know, something in the Amazon where, you know, people want to start logging or drilling for oil or something like that. So the initial intention was to include Abergynolwyn, and John Lloyd, whom I'm sure many of you know, who used to be the managing director of Abergynolwyn, was very supportive of the bid. And the quarry then changed hands, and the new owners, you know, fair enough, one couldn't fault them, were very, very cautious about the bid. And as we discussed more and more with them, it became clear that their mineral permissions were actually very extensive indeed. You could, in theory, quarry a lot of Abergynolwyn, and that would just scupper the bid so far as UNESCO was concerned. We did try and discuss with them whether we could just have a couple of tunnels, a few chambers, but after a while it became clear that this was just not going to work. So that's why. And if you have landowners who aren't in sympathy with what you're doing, then it's best not to bother. You know, it's their quarry after all. So we felt we'd back off there. Dan Quine, I noticed, has asked why not the Abergynolwyn quarries, and I hope I'm not going to offend Dan tremendously when I say I, like him, I am very interested in small rubbishy quarries. Because they are in some respects the most interesting. They're the sort of quarries that John Lloyd Jones would have wanted to flog off to somebody else at immense profit to himself. But with the best will in the world, they don't survive archaeologically to the extent that I think UNESCO would find persuasive. So that's, you know, I'm not being rude about Abergynolwyn. But you've got to imagine the reaction of somebody who's come, an inspector, UNESCO inspector who's come from foreign parts, and they're shown a small hole in the ground with some rusty rails.
Okay, thanks for that, David. I think that's picked up on Hannah's point. Rob, is there anything else you want to come back in on your question that you put in the chat?
Nothing really, sort of, say, just quite interested in my own personal interest in incline planes in general. Just quite interested whether the two, say at least two that I'm aware of, winding houses at Bryneglwys, whether they're particularly unique. As mentioned in the chat, there's the one immediately on the incline plane at the top of Bryneglwys, and there is another which I've explored some years ago, and it just struck me how particularly complete they were with the wooden winding drums still being there. Like I said, there's at least two. I don't know if there's any others that I missed. I just wonder if they're particularly unique in their significance.
Well, they're very nice surviving examples, and presumably very little changed from the 1860s. You know, what you really do see, I think in all these areas, in all 6 areas, is if you like, you know, you stand in the quarry, you say, right, okay, I see what this is about, and then you have these incline systems and level or near level railways that just show how engineers made use of topography to move the slate. You know, the self-acting incline for hundreds of years, people have said that this is a wonderful example of human ingenuity trading in on divine providence, you know, that God put the slate or whatever it might be in the mountains, and so it was all downhill to the sea, so you could move the stuff down by gravity. Absolutely wonderful. The one immediately beyond the Tailfin terminus is a scheduled monument. I was rather sorry to see that the footpath has been driven up it, and I do wonder whether it might be possible to realign the footpath and perhaps recreate the incline, because what you don't have on the Tailfin railway that you do have on the Festiniog, at the end of the passenger services, you don't get that very strong sense of here are the quarries. You know, that's very, very evident in a train arriving in Bryneglwys. So making more of the incline at Abergynolwyn, I think, would be well worth doing.
Thanks for that, David. We've got a question in from Richard. He's asking really around the timescale for knowing about the if there will be any success on the bid, or what would be happening at that stage.
The answer is June. It's all getting horribly real.
Right.
June of this year, they will let us know. Now, there are 3 options. One is referral. Well, 4 options. Acceptance, or possibly acceptance with referral, you know, sort out a few problems and we'll look at it again. But yeah, you can have your World Heritage bid. Deferral, where UNESCO say, you've got a case here, but it's not quite proven, go back and have a look at this, that and the other, or you're simply turned down.
Can I check on that? Is it competitive in that they only allocate so many a year, or is each application on its own merit?
Every application is on its own merit. The only thing is that one of the criticisms that's been levelled at UNESCO is that they certainly began with too many sites that had been built by dead white men. I mean, there was a time when practically every cathedral in France appeared to be becoming a World Heritage Site. So they've tried to move the emphasis much more away from that very European-centred approach to heritage. There's a less encouragement given to France, Britain, Germany, wherever, much more to places like Indonesia, Afghanistan, or whatever.
Good. Paul Winstone, do you want to come in on your question?
Yes, okay.
Good. Thanks, Paul.
I went up there a few years ago, having worked on the Tal Llyn, but as you say, the quarry was always a long way away. And I was amazed at how much there is there, but it is really difficult to interpret. Are there any plans to make it easier to see or to access any of the underground works?
Put it like this, I think Natural Resources Wales, who own the site, would be very receptive to some community-based projects.
Okay, because it's such a fantastic resource.
Oh, it is, yeah.
And I hadn't appreciated how many tunnels and caverns there are. They're really spectacular, aren't they?
They are. I would just say to anybody who wants to go and have an explore there, do bear in mind that the level tunnel off the Daylight Added, you now have to crawl over a great pile of shale, which reaches almost to the top of the tunnel, and you then have to wade up to chest level in extremely cold water. So
Okay.
be ready for it. Go underground.
It needs somebody with a shovel, doesn't it?
Yes, or a complete change of clothing on the far side.
Okay, thanks for that. Ray, you're the first that shows that the hands system is working. If you want to come in, Ray.
Yes, thank you. My interest in the quarry at Bryneglwys is that my family worked there during the 1800s. In fact, one of them was killed there during a fall. But in more recent times, I went up there and sat in the schoolrooms and looked around all the buildings. And I and my wife, I think it was in about 72, were very sad to see a film company had painted all the buildings white for a film, and subsequent to that, all the buildings were knocked down. My question really is a very much personal one: is there any source of photographs? Because sadly, I never took photographs at that time, or not many. Is there a source of the history of the quarry that is a bit more detailed, that other people might not be interested in, but I am?
Well, there are two good histories of the quarry, which is good going for a site that's not particularly big. And I know that Abergynolwyn as a community has very great interest in preserving photographs and records of the quarry. So maybe Jane is better placed to answer that question than I am.
Well, certainly we've got the Abergynolwyn Photo Archive, which has got hundreds of old photographs in it. It's been collected over 20 years. And at the moment, the plan is to put those photographs onto a website. In fact, they are on the website currently, but the website isn't live yet. So that work is being done as part of the community heritage project that we're working on. That's part of what we're doing. But there is the potential within the community heritage project that we're running now to take this work in a number of different directions. I mean, one of the other aspects of the work is that we're seeking funding, and we've got a very good chance of getting it, to install a memorial in the village to the quarry workers, and particularly to those who were killed or injured. So you might be interested in that. I think the community council will make the final decision about the form of it and its inscription and so on. But we may steer away from naming individuals because we're not sure we could name all of them. But anyway, so that's another strand of the work. And somebody previously as well mentioned about the rediscovering the inclines. And that's another strand that several members of the community have talked to me about and said they would really like, you know, as you say, to open up the inclines. And we're planning to meet with Natural Resources Wales about the work they've already done on opening up some of the views to the incline. But we'd like to see how we can, you know, increasing access to these to the site, both underground and overground, is part of our objectives as a project. But we're also very mindful that we need to do that in a responsible way, because there is a danger that the treasures that are still there could be damaged if it's not done carefully. And if we open it up to encourage increased visitors, we have to manage that in a careful way, because we're having to tread a balance between maintaining the landscape and meeting the needs of the visitors and the locals. So it's a complex project, and we'd welcome anybody that wants to get involved and be involved with it. You know, it's a lot of work, and we're looking for volunteers to get involved. So, you know, have a look at our Facebook page or get in touch with me afterwards. Can I just say, sorry, I don't want to take up too much time, but I'll say this now instead of at the end. We are planning to email everybody who's participated tonight with an evaluation form, but also we'll give you details about how to get in touch with us on that email as well. So if you want to follow it up.
Okay, thanks Jane for that. In the chat I've got Clive. Sorry, don't know your surname. Do you want to come in, Clive, on the question that you've posted? Can't hear you, Clive. I'll come back to you in a second then, Clive. We'll go to Dan Queen. Do you want to come in on your question?
Well, it wasn't really a question, more of an observation.
Yes, statements, yeah.
That there's you know, a lot of activity going on behind the scenes within the Talyllyn Railway about this, you know, potential for restoration of part of all of some of the inclines. I know this is a long-term ambition, but I think it would be very exciting to see, as Jane and David said, some movement there. I do think that presentation of the reason for being for the railway and the connection to the quarry and the village are very important. So I very much hope that comes to pass. Okay,
thanks for that. Hannah, you've got your hand up in the...
Oh, it's a question for Jane, really. What happened to the contents of the museum that you had in Abergynolwyn many years ago, once the owner died? And were they kept together in one place?
My understanding is that they were spread amongst a number of people. I have heard various rumours. One rumour was that some of it got buried. Don't ask me why, and I don't know the ins and outs of it or where it was buried, but some of the materials were buried. But basically people sort of took them away and they've just disappeared into the community. There is some interest in re-establishing a museum in the village. So as part of our work, we've been collecting sort of oral histories from people. We've been talking to some of the older locals about their own histories and their families' histories, and again that's very sensitive and painstaking work, but we have been given some historical documents.
I was wondering whether it was a condition or some other gifts that were given to the museum, whether the people wanted them back if the museum was, you know, came to a stop.
Well, what we would hope is that if a museum does get established, we would put out a call to all, you know, to the local community and beyond. If anybody has any of this material, you know, and they'd like to donate it back again, then obviously they, you know, we try and do that.
Thank you.
Yes.
I don't know, Colin, you put your hand up immediately. This question came in. I don't know if yours is directly related to this, is it?
Not directly.
No, it's okay. Then still carry on. You're okay.
Okay, no worries. Well, I'm actually talking to you from another World Heritage Site, as it happens. I happen to live in Abergynolwyn, and Bryneglwys World Heritage Site is over the hill, but actually the land of our house is within the World Heritage Site, and it's interesting that's quite a sprawling site, a little bit like the slate landscapes of North Wales will be. And one of the things that's done extremely well here in Bryneglwys is the way that all of those different sites, some of which are canals or ironworks and railways, etc., are tied together, and there is one kind of central visitor centre, which is extremely interesting actually, as well as useful. And that acts as kind of a central point from which people broadly come and then explore the wider kind of World Heritage Site. I was wondering if something similar was planned, i.e. are we learning the best practice from Bryneglwys and other World Heritage Sites, and how do we bring together what is such a large geographical area, and there's actually some quite substantial distances between parts of what will be, hopefully, the World Heritage Site?
That's again a very good question. It's been very interesting to see how Bryneglwys has panned out as a World Heritage Site, and the Llangollen Canal. And I think there are lessons for the council here from both of them. The council, I'd have to say, local government doesn't always have a very good name in Wales or anywhere else, but the council has just been absolutely superb in the way that it's run with the World Heritage bid. There's obviously, well, I say obviously, a lot to be said for, oh, now hang on, I've just seen Paul Lewin has more or less taken the words out of my mouth here, multiple gateways. It would be a very good idea to perhaps get visitors to, having visited one place, to go and visit another. Now, some of this is already going on. For instance, people who've been to the Slate Museum Llanberis, told, well, if you want to go and see how the other half lived, or rather the other, not half at all, the very, very rich, go to Penrhyn Castle and the National Trust. People who enjoy travelling on narrow gauge railways, if they're coming to North Wales, they'll not just go on the Towllyn, they'll go to the Festiniog as well. So there are all sorts of opportunities here. Now, my role in this bid has been more putting it together in such a way that UNESCO, we hope, will say, oh yeah, great, we're persuaded. But I've watched with interest what the council is doing, and the idea of empowering local communities is absolutely central to what they've been doing, and I think that's absolutely right.
Oh, thanks for that. Fergus, do you want to come in on your particular point? Are you there, Fergus? Well, you're asking about more talks, perhaps. I'll come back to you again afterwards then. Marianne Edwards, around Tallothlyn and the extension of the rail line. Do you want to come in on that? You're there, Marianne? Okay, I'll come to Dan because you got your hand up again, Dan, okay?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on that multiple gateways idea, which I think is a tremendous potential asset for this. And I really like it. And I do think there's a really fascinating tale that you can tell, which is, what David was talking about in his talk was how the people connect these places, and how both the Welsh communities actually connect strongly between these various slate and other industries, and also the English industrialists and capitalists who came in. They're all very interconnected. There's a fascinating interconnection into Manchester and the mill owners there, as well as the local quarrymen and local quarry owners who often moved between these areas and that technology transfer. I just think you could tell such a fascinating story there of that interconnection, and how all these things, how all these apparently disparate places connect together. I'd love to see that happen.
Well, I do remember, Dan, when you and I were discussing something on Facebook a few years ago, you drew a connection between the Abergynolwyn quarries, the manufacturer of linoleum, and I seem to remember the late unlamented Benito Mussolini.
Yes, it's, once you start pulling on the threads, it's amazing where you can go. So yes, I mean, very much building on that sort of idea. And I now connect into Penryn and the Derbyshires in Penmanmara and other places. So I do think it's all of this connects, and it is fascinating to see the human connections as well as the technical ones.
Yeah, well, I think technical connections are ultimately human ones. This is what appeals to me. I must admit, I find Robert Williams a fascinating individual, and you can just imagine this bloke, can't you? Coming down from Carnarvonshire, speaking Welsh, but with a very different accent. He's mated with John Lloyd Jones, and anybody with any judgment will think he's a bit of a dodgy individual, and he starts bringing all this Nantler technology, and then the McConnells come in, and wow, what a story, what a story.
The next, I'm going to link a couple of the questions together. It's around the railway, really. There's one question from Marion around, did Tanathlin Railway actually go further up the line into Bryneglwys village, and could it be extended further in future? We've also got one around a slate tourist route and slate version of the Great Little Trains of Wales and Great Little Veins of Wales. Somebody's coming up with some good strap lines there, I think. Any comments at all with regard to the railway and the Talyllyn and how that could, or whether it did actually have a connection in the past?
Well, wasn't there talk at one time, about 100 years ago, of actually connecting the Talyllyn and the Corris Railway by electricity, I seem to remember. We'd have had electric locomotives running from Abergynolwyn station to Corrisuchaf. I don't know. But the idea of, perhaps multiple gateways, great little veins of Wales, I do rather like that. There's also, this may sound a bit counterintuitive, but we've got 3 World Heritage Sites already in Wales. 2 of them are industrial, one's a canal and one's a landscape. There's actually, to my mind, also quite an interesting synergy between the 3rd one and the slate one, and the 3rd one is the castles of Edward I, because they tell the story about the coming of urban living, the money economy, and incorporation of Wales into the Anglo-Plantagenet Norman state. The slate story tells the story of Wales's incorporation into the capital economy of the British Empire and the Atlantic world in the 19th century. So there's the option, I think, in Wales of telling a Makers of Wales story that places Wales right in the global arena. We should have a global Wales from now on, and this might be the spur to doing it.
Good, thanks for that. Paul, you've got your hand up.
Yes, I have indeed. It's going back to the comments that Jane made about the possibility of visitors to the quarry at Abergynolwyn, and how it must be controlled. You've only got to look around Dinorwic and Minor Ferrin to see the damage that has been done over the years. I mean, I've been visiting it for 25, 30 years, so I'm a newcomer, but sadly, it's increasingly prevalent that stuff is just smashed up for the sake of it or stolen. And it needs to really be controlled.
That's what Paul says is very true. I mean, Minor Ferrin has been subject of a lot of theft and deliberate vandalism, but most of it actually outright theft. And Dinorwic is a rather contentious environment. One of the things that I think perhaps I should have emphasized at the beginning is that World Heritage does not impose a right of public access. And NG, as owners of Dinorwic, have been adamant, quite rightly, that they don't want people going into Dinorwic Quarry. Now, I think it's going to be very, very difficult to police that because it's such a popular venue with climbers and with walkers. The fact that Bryneglwys is owned by Natural Resources Wales, and also it's a smaller site with fewer vulnerable surface features, I think opens the possibility that there could be controlled access to the place, and there are public footpaths through it.
Good, thank you. There's a couple of promotions there for a couple of books. One is around the village policeman, which sounds an absolutely fascinating historical book, and there was another one somebody referred to with regard to Sarah Reid's book on Talyllyn. So there's some reference material there if somebody wants a weekend read. Dan's flagged up that. Paul, Lewin, do you want to come in on your bit around, you're putting in a link there with regard to Boston Lodge? Are you there, Paul? No, okay, we'll come back if you want to in the chat then. Krona, I can see you've got a hand up.
Hi, yes, thank you, David. Thank you for your fascinating talk. We moved to the area about 7 or 8 years ago. Here, my family and I are in Abergynolwyn, and I'm going to have to watch this recording back. There's so much in there, and I feel like I've got so much to learn. We just had a quick question about one of our favourite parts of the area is Pontllair on the Roman Bridge, sort of above the Quarry area, and we were wondering about the supposed links with Pennal. And up there by the bridge there's like a reservoir area as well. I wondered if that whole area is within the sort of bid area. I don't know if that's outside. We have to go out of the sort of boundary of the quarry, I think, to get to that. I just kind of wondered about that whole area and its relevance to the quarry, and also our links with Pennal back before the rail days, I think, when they moved the state on ponies.
Well, to answer your question, the reservoir and the Pontllair area is within the bid because the quarry was very much a water-driven quarry. So we wanted to show the whole archaeology of the power systems there. The danger, of course, with including too much is that it becomes unmanageable. And what I've been saying to people is, don't worry if your particular favorite site isn't in it. This is going to be a consciousness raising exercise, and so we can point out other linkages. As you say, there's, I mean, the whole story of slate export down to Pennal, the little quarries above Pennal itself, very interesting. So yeah, there's a lot there that we can say. Also, if it becomes clear in a few years' time, if we're successful, that we ought to tweak the boundary a little bit to include something else, something that we've forgotten about or that we didn't understand, then that's quite possible. It's not a difficult job.
Well, thanks for that. Just going through the chat there, Clive has added some things in there with regard to possible slate tourist routes, making a number of linkages there that he's included. Dan's referred to the Boston Lodge. Going back to Paul's, sorry about this, I'm just, yeah, Paul was in relation to Boston Lodge as well. So that was just some additional information, wasn't it, around National Lottery heritage bid that was going on there. Can we just, I'm conscious of the time, I just wonder, has anybody got any questions? Because I'm sure one of the sort of burning questions that we could probably need to ask in a second is really around what is the next steps if successful, how do people get engaged? Jane's obviously referred to information on the site and the follow-up through the evaluation. Are there any particular things that you would like to flag up, David, with regard to success and what that might mean for people who are online this evening?
Well, I think the first thing to do is, if you're not already following the bid on Facebook, you might like to do so. Wales Slate Project. There's a lot in this for young people as well. The possibility of developing, say, schools programs is a very, very strong one. I think I'm right in saying that the council has just managed to secure funding for an extension of the Llechi project. Llechi being, of course, at one at the same time, Llechi, your place, and also Llechi, Slate. So that's quite a clever little pun. But I think the way that I see it is that if local communities feel that this is a good thing and that it's got something to offer, that really it's going to be up to all you good people to decide the direction you want to take this.
Good, thanks, David. I mean, with your information, Jane, I'm perhaps passing over to yourself with regard to sort of next steps in from your point of view, what that might actually appear to be for people to engage.
Well, as I say, we will be sending out an email to everybody when we'll ask for feedback on the talk and provide information there about our Facebook page, the Abergynolwyn Community Heritage Facebook page, and how people can engage with that. There will be future events, but we are also looking, as I say, to involve people as volunteers, because this is potentially a very big project. And so, you know, people that want to get involved in doing things, then certainly they can do that as well. And yes, I mean, you know, I think we're planning to, as well as putting output onto the Facebook page, we are also producing printed material from links in the Facebook page for the community locally that is not online, because they are a significant part of the community. You know, about a third of our people here are local Welsh people, a lot of whom are not online. And we're very conscious of that we need to, you know, in this work, we need to have a balance between all the different constituent parts of the community. So that's another aspect to it. So those are the main ways of doing it, really.
Good, that sounds extremely good on that. I've got no outstanding questions at all. I just want, oh, sorry, I've got one from Sue. Interesting links in the chat. Yeah, sorry, Sue. Yeah, there's a number of sort of book links and other information that could be in there. I'm actually just going to ask everybody to unmute, and the reason for that is, although we are in a virtual world, I think it's fair to say that if we were in the real world in the same space, one of the first things, or one of the last things that we would be doing at the end of this, something like that, is just to give a very brief round of applause for David and Jane with regard to this.
Fantastic. Well done. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I see Sue's hand. Sue, has your hand just gone up, or is it what you put in the chat? No, we can't hear you, Sue. Sorry. Okay, so over to yourself, I think, Jane, just to close. But it is nice to have a bit of an applause, isn't it? You know, for everything that's been said, and really fascinating this evening what's been discussed.
Yes, thanks, John. Thank you. Well, again, I'd just like to repeat the thanks, really. I mean, big thanks to David. You know, we really appreciate his input and his knowledge. I mean, you know, it's such a rich history. There's such a lot to draw on, and I think David made that clear, really. And also obviously thanks to John for chairing the session and for being my backup person.
I don't know whether Royston, I don't know, your hand was up a second ago. Just, do you want to be the final one with a question or anything?
No, I just want to introduce myself. I'm Royston Jones. I run the photo archive.
Can I just say apologies to people who didn't get the link in time to get on at the beginning of the talk. We will offer the chance of sending out the recording to everybody if that was an issue for you. So apologies about that.
Thank you, Jane.
Okay.
It's part of the learning curve to do everything earlier next time.
Right.
Okay, well, look, have a safe journey home, everybody.
Everybody's nipping off down the pub now, are they?
If only. Well, you know, we will get there eventually. Thank you very much, everybody, for your time and your interest. It's been fascinating, and we hope to see you all again at future events. Take care now. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye, thank you.
Goodbye.